Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, buckle up everybody, because today we are diving deep into a really pivotal decade in the fight against Jim Crow.
Absolutely.
We're talking 1945 to 1955.
Big decade.
A period that really set the stage for the civil rights movement that we know. And our source material for this deep dive is a podcast episode called Breaking Down Jim Crow: The NAACP, State Reforms, and the Supreme Court, 1945 to 1955.
Catchy title.
Right. Now, this might seem like a while ago, but trust me, the echoes of this era are still felt today.
Absolutely. And, you know, most people, when they think about this era, they immediately jump to Brown v. Board of Education.
Right.
But there is so much more to this story. It's really fascinating. It's a story of how just countless legal battles, a lot of them lesser known, really chipped away at Jim Crow laws and fueled this growing movement for equality.
I think what I found so interesting, and the podcast episode actually starts with this, is that by 1952, 11 states and 20 cities already had fair employment laws on the books.
Wow.
I mean, that's years before the major federal legislation of the Civil Rights era.
It is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
And one of the key factors that was driving this early progress was the experience of Black World War II veterans returning home.
Oh, interesting.
Imagine fighting for democracy abroad, only to return to a country where you're denied basic rights because of the color of your skin.
Yeah.
I mean, these veterans became really powerful voices for change.
Totally.
Pushing for those same freedoms that they had just fought to protect overseas.
It makes you realize, I mean, they're seeing it firsthand, this hypocrisy.
Exactly.
And it wasn't just about employment, right?
Right.
The podcast mentions that 19 states were tackling discrimination in other areas as well.
Exactly. For instance, only 5 states still had that poll tax by this time.
Wow.
Huge change.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah, and these state-level reforms, they're often overlooked.
Right.
But they were incredibly significant. They showed that progress was possible.
Yeah.
And they provided a testing ground for a lot of the legal arguments.
Oh, interesting.
That would later be used in the national fight against segregation.
It's almost like practice.
It's like a ripple effect, you know?
Yeah.
Starting small and gradually gaining momentum.
Speaking of legal strategy,
the
podcast really highlights the NAACP and their work during this time.
Incredible.
They were so laser-focused on dismantling the foundation of segregation, this separate but equal doctrine.
And to understand why that was so important, we have to go back to that infamous 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson ruling.
Okay.
This Supreme Court decision, it established the legal basis for segregation.
Right.
Saying that separate facilities for Black and white people were constitutional as long as they were equal.
Right. The famous separate but equal.
But of course,
in reality,
separate was never truly equal.
Right.
But this doctrine gave cover for decades of Jim Crow laws.
So how did the NAACP go about challenging this system that was so ingrained in everything?
Well, their chief legal strategist was Thurgood Marshall.
Okay.
Who later became the first Black Supreme Court justice.
Right.
So Marshall had this brilliant approach.
Okay.
He targeted cases where that separate part of separate but equal was just demonstrably unequal.
Got it.
His goal was to expose the inherent flaws in this doctrine and force the court to confront the reality of segregation.
So this is where things start to get really interesting. Yeah. The podcast points to 1950 as a pivotal year with 3 key Supreme Court rulings that chipped away at separate but equal and really paved the way for Brown v. Board of Education.
Huge.
These cases were Henderson v. United States, McLaurin v. Oklahoma State Regents, and Sweatt v. Painter.
Yeah. Each one targeted a different aspect of segregation.
Okay.
But they all had this common thread, demonstrating that separate was inherently unequal in practice.
I'm really curious about these cases. Let's break them down one by one.
Okay, let's do it.
What happened in Henderson v. United States?
Okay, so in this case, the court dealt with segregated dining cars on interstate trains.
Okay.
A Black passenger named Henderson was denied service.
Wow.
In the dining car because of his race.
Oh, wow.
And the court ultimately ruled that segregation in this instance was unconstitutional.
Interesting.
Arguing that separate facilities were inherently unequal in this context.
So that's a pretty big win, I would say.
It was a significant victory, and it signaled that the court was really starting to rethink its stance on separate but equal.
Okay, so then there's McLaurin v. Oklahoma State Regents.
Right.
This case involved a Black doctoral student who was admitted to the University of Oklahoma, but he was forced to sit separately from his white classmates in the classrooms, library, even the cafeteria.
This case really exposes the absurdity of separate but equal.
Yeah.
Imagine trying to get a doctoral education while being ostracized and separated from your peers.
Constantly.
So the court ruled in favor of McLaurin, striking down this blatant discrimination, powerful statement, recognizing that separate facilities in this context weren't just inconvenient, they were fundamentally unequal.
And then we have Sweatt v. Painter, which tackles segregated law schools. So in this case, a Black applicant named Heman Sweatt was denied admission to the University of Texas Law School.
Simply because of his race.
Wow.
The state of Texas argued that it had created a separate law school for Black students. But the court found that this separate law school was vastly inferior to the white law school in terms of faculty resources and prestige.
So they were finally acknowledging that separate wasn't equal, at least in this case.
Exactly. And the legal reasoning in Sweatt v. Painter was particularly significant. The court went beyond just looking at tangible factors like facilities and faculty. They considered the intangible aspects of legal education, arguing that being part of a prestigious and well-connected law school was crucial for a successful legal career.
Oh, okay.
And they determined that denying Black students access to the main law school deprived them of these intangible benefits, making separate inherently unequal.
This was a major turning point, wouldn't you say?
Major turning point.
Yeah. It seems like these three cases really lay the groundwork for Brown v. Board.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
These rulings created a powerful legal precedent, demonstrating that separate but equal was failing in practice. And that the court was becoming increasingly receptive to arguments against segregation.
So it's not just about the arguments themselves.
It's about the context and the fact that they're getting through. These victories were also a testament to the growing momentum of the civil rights movement.
It must have felt like things were starting to change.
Absolutely.
So what happened next? How did these legal and social changes impact the NAACP strategy?
Their strategy going forward.
Well,
that's where we'll pick up in part 2 of our deep dive.
Sounds good.
We'll explore how the NAACP leveraged these early victories to push for even broader changes, culminating in that landmark Brown v. Board of Education decision.
Can't wait.
Big one!
Yeah, I know. I'm excited. So we've seen how these early legal victories chipped away at separate but equal and really set the stage for Brown v. Board. But the podcast also digs into how historians view this era. And it turns out there are a few different schools of thought on how these legal battles and state reforms fit into the larger picture of the civil rights movement.
It's not just the simple linear progression. Historians have different perspectives on what the most impactful factors were.
The podcast mentions this legalist school of thought.
The legalists.
That's their take.
Legalist historians, like Richard Kluger, who wrote Simple Justice. They really emphasize the brilliance of the NAACP's legal strategy and the pivotal role of the Supreme Court. They see the court's willingness to actually reconsider separate but equal as absolutely crucial to the movement's success.
So they're all about those courtroom victories.
Exactly.
The power of legal precedent.
The power of legal precedent.
Building that case.
They highlight how the NAACP, under Thurgood Marshall's leadership, took a very strategic, incremental approach. Each case they chose was very carefully selected to build upon previous victories.
Interesting.
Creating a solid foundation of case law that would ultimately lead to Brown v. Board. They were playing the long game, and it paid off.
Building a strong legal argument.
Brick by brick.
Brick by brick. I like that. What about the traditionalist school?
So the traditionalists...
How do they view things?
Traditionalist historians, folks like John Hope Franklin, place more emphasis on the state and local reforms that were happening alongside those court battles. They see these reforms as really essential precursors to the larger movement.
So for them, it's about the groundwork laid at the state level.
Yeah.
Showing that change was possible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They argue that these local and state victories showed that dismantling segregation was achievable, which then emboldened African Americans and civil rights organizations to push for broader reforms on a national scale. Plus, some of those early state-level reforms actually provided models for later federal legislation.
Okay, so starting to see how these different perspectives add some nuance to our understanding of this era.
Right.
Now, the podcast also mentions a progressive school of thought.
Yes.
How do they view this period?
Progressive historians, like Howard Zinn, take a more critical stance. While they acknowledge the importance of the court rulings and state reforms, they argue that these changes didn't go far enough to address the deeply rooted systemic issues of racism that impacted everyday life for African Americans.
So they're saying legal changes alone weren't enough.
Right.
What else was needed in their view?
Well, Zinn, for example, argues that true racial equality requires addressing social and economic inequalities. Things like access to quality education, housing, and employment opportunities. These were areas where progress was much slower and where that legacy of discrimination continued to have a profound impact.
That's an important point. Legal victories are crucial.
Sure.
But they don't automatically translate into lived equality for everyone.
Absolutely.
Okay, what about social historians?
The social historians.
What's their lens on all of this?
Social historians, folks like Patricia Sullivan, focus on the power of grassroots activism and local movements in driving change. They argue that those state reforms and Supreme Court decisions weren't happening in a vacuum. They were influenced by the increasing pressure in activism coming from African American communities and civil rights organizations.
So they're highlighting the power of the people.
Exactly.
Those everyday heroes who are pushing for change on the ground.
Pushing for change on the ground,
It's a reminder that legal and political battles are fueled by the tireless efforts of individuals and communities fighting for their rights.
Fighting for their rights.
The NAACP was waging these legal battles. But they were doing so with the backing of a growing movement for social justice. This is so fascinating.
It is.
We've got legal strategies, state reforms, judicial activism, and grassroots movements.
It's all happening.
All converging in this pivotal decade.
At the same time.
It's like a perfect storm brewing.
It is,
And it's all about to explode.
About to explode.
Into the civil rights movement as we know it.
The podcast emphasizes that the actions of state governments, the NAACP's legal victories, and the growing activism on the ground created this incredible momentum that would soon lead to the mass mobilization of the 1950s and 1960s.
Okay, so we've unpacked these different historical perspectives. But there's one more piece of the puzzle that the podcast mentions. It says this period between 1945 and 1955 wasn't just about legal victories. It was about something much bigger.
It was
about shifting the narrative. The podcast argues that all of these legal battles and state reforms, they played a crucial role in changing how people viewed segregation and racial inequality. It wasn't just about changing laws, it was about changing minds.
Precisely. These victories helped expose those contradictions at the heart of separate but equal. They demonstrated that separate was never truly equal in practice. And as these injustices were brought to light, it really challenged the deeply ingrained beliefs and prejudices that had propped up Jim Crow for decades.
So it was about planting those seeds of doubt, making people question what they'd always been told about race and equality.
Exactly. And as more and more people saw the injustice of segregation firsthand, as they witnessed these legal victories and saw states taking action, it helped create a climate where the larger civil rights movement could flourish.
It's like those early victories gave people hope that change was possible. It emboldened them to speak out, to organize, to demand their full rights as citizens.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about African Americans. These legal battles and the growing movement for equality also began to sway public opinion among white Americans. As more people saw the brutality and the unfairness of segregation, they started to question the status quo.
That's powerful. It wasn't just about changing laws, it was about changing hearts and minds. This deep dive has been eye-opening.
It has.
It's amazing to see how all these seemingly separate events Court rulings, state reforms, activism were all interconnected, building upon each other to create this incredible wave of change.
It really highlights how social change happens. It's rarely a single event or a single person that sparks a movement. It's this combination of factors of legal challenges, political shifts, and most importantly, the tireless efforts of everyday people demanding justice and equality.
And it's a reminder that the fight for equality is an ongoing process. We've come a long way since the Jim Crow era, but the legacy of systemic racism and inequality persists. The battles may look different today, but that struggle for justice continues.
I think that's the key takeaway for our listeners today. Understanding this era isn't just about looking back at history. It's about understanding the present and the future. What are the injustices that we face today? What are the narratives that shape our world? And what role do each of us play in challenging those narratives and creating a more just and equitable society for everyone?
That's a great point to end on. So, as you go about your day, deep divers, think about that. What are the battles being fought today? How can we learn from the past to build a better future? Until next time, keep diving deep.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.